I think what we're going to do now is try and attempt to facilitate a hypothetical exercise. We thought this would be a good way to try and really get to the bottom of the issues and see, pose some questions to the audience to see, if you were in a hypothetical situation where you were confronted with, engagement with the listed entities, what you would do. And so Dustin and Naz will introduce the exercise, and then I think what we will do here in London is, perhaps have you congregate in small groupings, unless you want to attempt to answer the questions individually, which you're welcome to do. And people can try and respond also online through the web chat. But Naz and Dustin will frame the exercise, explain where we are, in which country, what's happening, and then ask you questions about what you would do. And then we'll go back to them to see whether the answers were adequate or raise more problems rather than potential solutions. Naz and Dustin, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. So if we could pull up the second PowerPoint with the exercise, that would be great. Thank you. So we are going to give you a fictional scenario with certainly, I think everyone will recognize that it's very much rooted in fact. But what we have found in doing these kinds of exercises is that it makes it much easier for all of us to talk about these questions and challenges if we can do so at least with the veneer of the hypothetical nature. Next slide, please. So the usual disclaimer that this is an academic exercise. I think everyone knows they shouldn't base any of their institutional decision making. And next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to just read this out because I know there's quite a bit on the PowerPoint. So I'll read the background information, and then Dustin will read the what role you are in. The country we are in is called Landestan. It is a small country with a number of religious groups who have historically lived peacefully in the country. It is experiencing an uprising against a brutal monarch, and this has grown into a vicious non-international armed conflict. So there is an armed conflict ongoing between government forces and armed insurgent groups. More than 30 armed groups are active in a part of Landestan that is no longer effectively controlled by the government. In an attempt to encourage increased humanitarian assistance in those areas controlled by the armed groups, donors have issued licenses authorizing transactions with most of these groups. So they've said it's okay if there's minimal diversion to most of these armed groups. One group, however, is called the Armed Opposition Army, the AOA, and it's by far the most successful on the battlefield, one of the strongest groups. It controls the largest swath of territory in the territory controlled by the armed groups and is the best resource. The AOA has been listed as a terrorist organization by our donor that we will be thinking of as in terms of our role here, and by a number of other major donor governments, as well as by the government of Landestan and by the United Nations Security Council. The AOA has claimed that it effectively acts as the local governing authority in 1/3 of the territory of Landestan, and this claim seems to be quite legitimate in terms of their actual control. They control access to some 8 million members of the population, the country's largest oil and gas refineries, and the only state-of-the-art hospital outside of the nation's capital is under AOA control. Next slide, please.
Excellent. So what is your role in this hypothetical? Your London-based organization, unfortunately not Cambridge-based in Massachusetts, but London, is called Health Caring in Crisis, HIC. You're a medical humanitarian INGO, and you have about 740 local staff in Landestan. You have around $200 million for a global budget, and $30 million of that is support earmarked for the Landestani crisis. You have a large international team based on the border to Landestan. You for this exercise are the HIC Landestan country director. You have regularly been traveling into Landestan for extended multi-week field trips. You're two based at the border. And you speak fluent Landestani, and you spent several years pre-conflict working on improving access to how medical care is spent and provided to all Landestanis. You understand the Landestani people. At this time, Healthcare in Crisis is the only medical humanitarian INGO operating in the part of Landestan controlled by the armed opposition army. The needs are far outstripping capacity, and you are witnessing the daily degradation of access to the health facilities. Next slide, please.
So if that weren't dramatic enough, you, the country director, recently learned that your organization has treated many wounded and sick members of the AOA. They have a very noticeable armband that your staff is very familiar with in the field, alongside civilians in your medical clinics. You have treated members of other armed groups as well as members of the Landestani armed forces who've been captured by these armed groups. Second, you've learned, and you're quite concerned about this information, that a major AOA commander who was previously treated by one of your best international doctors in one of your field clinics has returned to the battlefield, and newspapers are reporting on the fact that, having been brought back to good health, he is wreaking havoc on the battlefield. The AOA is increasingly requesting, and you're hearing this from a number of your fellow humanitarian colleagues, that aid organizations pay taxes and warehouse fees. These fees are similar to those that the Landestani government requests of you on a regular basis, and they are commensurate with what your organization has been asked for by other states in other armed conflict situations. Next slide.
All right, so now turn it over to you guys to figure out how best to address this. You have 4 different questions that we're posing for the dilemmas here. And 2 of them relate to a field coordinator who's asking you some things, and the other 2 relate to your executive director back in London. So again, you're the Landestani country director. So the first 2 questions come from your field coordinator. She's asking you whether Healthcare in Crisis should continue to treat all wounded fighters, including AOA members. Second, she's wondering whether or not the local staff should actually pay the taxes and warehouse fees. From a slightly different perspective, the executive director in London is asking whether or not you can certify that you're complying with all relevant laws and policies that might be applicable to the organization. And second, should your organization continue operating in Landestan at all, given this set of concerns and these recent developments? Sarah,
Excellent.
over to you.
Thank you so much. So you're welcome to raise your hands and reply on your own, but I'm also happy to give 5 minutes to the audience if you want to come in groups of 2 or 3 people and discuss together what you may do. Just spend a few minutes thinking through it, and what you would do if you were the field coordinator or the executive director, how you would answer these questions posed by the field coordinator or the executive director. And then I'll ask a few people from the floor, and also the online audience is very welcome to answer these questions. Maybe we can leave the questions on the slide so that people can continue to see them. And then we'll share them with everyone, your answers, and Naz and Dustin will comment on the relevance, appropriateness of continued dilemma posed by the answer.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
What percentage of wounded fighters is being treated versus percentage of normal population?
Okay.
The percentage of wounded fighters representing all groups, so not only AOA, is 60%, 60.
Great. I'll leave 5 minutes. You can, to talk to your colleague next to you. It's another question of clarification. Yeah.
Can I ask, it's not.
So just to say, it's another question of clarification.
I'm not sure if it's working. Is it working?
Yeah. Yes.
It's not.
Sorry,
There's one more question of clarification.
I think we need some clarification as to how long AOA has been in effective control of the region where it is operating, and also whether it is actually claiming to be a de facto government of the region. That needs to be clarified. Thank you.
Let's say that AOA has been in control, territorial control, for about 2 months, so it's quite recent. And they are saying that they are effectively governing that part of the territory.
Great. Then let me just, allow you to think, discuss with your neighbors, and in a few minutes I'll ask a few people to volunteer answers. The field coordinator asks whether HIC should continue to treat all wounded fighters, including AOA members. Any answer to that? Yes. Microphone, 1 second.
Hi. We thought that they probably should continue providing medical care because drawing comparisons to Al-Shabaab in Somalia, when anti-terrorist laws sort of prevented food going into the country, food was easier to convert into cash, which could be used to sort of fund terrorist activities. But healthcare is slightly different because although you might be able to, take some health supplies and sell it, I can't imagine the market is nearly as big as food during a famine. And the other thing is the whole basis of international humanitarian law when it was first established was to help wounded soldiers. So if an organisation is going to sort of put that down as its principle, then they should uphold it. And as long as you're treating both sides in an equal way, then I think that's absolutely fine.
Any differing views? Thank you very much. Any other thoughts about that? So do they all agree with? Yes.
I suppose what I would be looking to examine, I agree with the previous principle, but I think the key question from a legal sense is actually, are you then providing infrastructure support to the organisation? If it's 60% of wounded fighters, is 55% of those a designated organisation? If so, I would say it's actually infrastructure support, which then triggers a whole lot of other considerations.
Excellent. Gentleman at the back, and then we move to the second question.
I suppose the question I want is to clarify that you're treating them with the intention of returning them to combat. Is there no way you can treat them and prevent them from returning to combat and isolate? Are you only working on the borders and you can transfer them into refugee populations or similar? Sounds
Nazi,
stupid,
do you get
but
that?
It's yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Yes. Very good. Okay. The second question: whether HIC local staff should pay the AOA requested taxes and warehouse fees. Views on that? Nobody wants to attempt this one. Yes, Veronique.
I guess one option is to negotiate. I think many humanitarian organizations actually talk with governments about having some tax exemptions, tariff customs on humanitarian goods. I think you have a room there where you can actually negotiate with the armed group, try to make the armed group understand what you're trying to do, and that this money being taken away from humanitarian assistance is being taken away from the populations you are governing and trying to help. So,
Lady at the front, thank you.
Thank you. I think it depends on the remit under which the organisation has actually gone into the country. And if it does agree to pay taxes to AOA, then it is in effect recognising that it is a de facto government of the area, and might find itself then in conflict with the government that actually allowed it to go into the country. So there's a potential quagmire there to be avoided.
And two more over there, and then we go back to Naz and Dustin. Thank you very much.
I think also I would point out that a lot of our donor agreements actually don't allow us to pay. Certainly not VAT and often customs duties. So we wouldn't have been paying it to the government of Landistan, or at least we spend a lot of time telling them that we don't pay you because that's not in our remit to pay taxes to the government of the country where we're operating. That's not what the money's funded for. So I think that is a much more of a no-go area. We spend time negotiating with legitimate governments, never mind ones that may or may not be legitimate. So I think that we would try pretty hard not to do that. I think it would cause a lot of problems.
Thank you. And is gentleman next to you?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's important to for groups out there to provide the humanitarian assistance because, first of all, under international humanitarian law, the principle is that we are providing impartial humanitarian assistance. If we are abiding by domestic counter-terrorism law, for instance, in the UK, let's just say in a country like Landistan, where there's two groups and there's a major coalition going after them, then we have to question, are we kind of making our framework in compliant with the domestic to seek a political outlook in a conflict, or are we, trying to uphold humanitarian values? So I personally don't see any impediments lawfully for providing assistance to fighters, because number one, they're in effective control of the territory, and therefore they have the authority. Moreover, I think ICRC, the ICRC, they also negotiate with groups, including Al-Shabaab, and I know they've personally tried to make some attempts with ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra and so on and so forth. So I think it should be left open, and negotiation and paying taxes should be going forth. I think specifically if they are trying to use this money for humanitarian assistance.
Interesting. Naz and Dustin, back to you.
Okay, wonderful. And I'm sorry, but I have to say this technology is incredible. We're sitting here marveling at the fact that we can see all of you. So congratulations to HBN. Yes, so wonderful reflections. I will try to take some of the answers to 1 and 2, and then I want to make sure that Dustin has an opportunity to respond to the gentleman who spoke last. One, I think, I hear the comment, and forgive me for not knowing people's names, so I'm going to have to say the lady and the gentleman, but the first lady who spoke, as well as someone who had participated online, was raising this issue, which I hear as being very much rooted in international humanitarian law, saying there is a body of law that says that all of those who are wounded and out of the fight or the combat must be provided with medical care, right? And it makes no distinction as to whether it's an armed group or a member of enemy armed forces or your own armed forces. And calling someone a terrorist doesn't change that. IHL still recognizes that. And I hear those comments as saying, how can we change our practice in light of counterterrorism law when IHL clearly carves out this space for medical care? And that is precisely the dilemma in some ways, right? You're both right to say it is in the text of IHL that medical care for wounded fighters is not only allowed, it is indeed required. But what happens when that medical care is to individuals who in a completely different body of law, that is counterterrorism, are listed, and when that medical care is seen as potentially violating the law? We simply don't have an answer right now. And my sense is that this area of medical care may be one where there's really an opportunity for the humanitarian community to emphasize and to speak to the public about why is this at the core of humanitarianism? Why is it that we insist that even our enemy should receive medical care? What's behind that notion? It sort of brings us back to the very early days of humanitarianism, but this may be a moment when we need to remind ourselves of that very basic principle. Second, I just wanted to incorporate the comment from the gentleman in the back about we all sort of laughed, but he said, is there a way you can guarantee that those people aren't going to go back out to the battlefield? And of course, if you are an NGO, the answer is no, right? You're not going to detain people if you're an NGO, and you're never going to hand them over to the armed forces if you're an NGO. And so one of the dilemmas here is, in IHL, if you are a state and you care for the enemy forces in your hospital, of course you're going to take them into detention after they've been treated, right? You're not going to release them. If you are a humanitarian organization, you will never be able to say, we will treat people and then we will imprison them. And one of the concerns of the counterterrorism community may well be that humanitarian assistance that benefits terrorist organizations can then be used by them to enhance their ability to carry out attacks. I wanted to let Dustin take on the negotiation issue, but also this question of the taxes and what are the dilemmas that arise, because I think in some ways that's much more common than the medical care problem.
Great. Thanks, Naz. And thanks for these great questions. They definitely flesh out a lot of the dilemmas we're seeking to address with these two questions. One overarching point is that negotiation and talking is seen differently in the law than provision of material resources. So here under IHL, Naz had mentioned at the outset that there's a right of initiative. So under IHL, the Common Article 3, applicable, everyone sees to all armed conflicts, non-international or international. Organizations, humanitarian organizations can offer their services to all parties to the conflict, but it's the provision of the resources then that has the real potential to conflict with the domestic law framework. So again, negotiation, discussion, etc., is as a general matter not conceived of under the law as violating some sort of counterterrorism norm. It's much more when coordination goes into provision of resources or actual what's called material support under the law. When it comes to, and that sort of brings me into the question that the woman is talking about with respect to whether to pay the warehouse or the taxes fees. Absolutely, if humanitarian organizations have been able to negotiate with governments that they should be exempted from warehouse fees, from other types of taxes, etc., that provides them with a very strong argument and a negotiation standpoint vis-a-vis the armed groups, whether or not they're designated as terrorists, to say, we haven't provided it to the government, we're not providing to you, this adheres to our humanitarian principles, and you have a much stronger negotiation standpoint. That said, some non-state armed groups designated as terrorists are going to require the payments. You see in some of the contract clauses in other situations, such as, in particular situations such as Somalia, that the US government imposed what's called enhanced due diligence. They didn't allow or exempt any of these payments, but they did say effectively that were those payments to occur, you have to let us know immediately that it happened, what were the circumstances, and what steps you've taken to ensure that it won't happen again. Now, some of the comments brought up this broader question of the immediacy of getting and maintaining access versus the long-term, the ability for your organization to operate there, and I think that's exactly right. Yeah. As to the last gentleman's remarks concerning the distinctions between applying the international legal framework, especially IHL, and not necessarily being as concerned with the domestic law framework, that is definitely an approach that many organizations can and do take. It, though, has potential consequences, especially in areas where the government has a lot more scrutiny, where there's a lot more concern on things like diversion to armed groups, and where, for instance, the Security Council has listed Al-Qaeda or ISIS or other organizations that it's very hard to ignore in total the potential effects of those domestic regimes going all the way across all those borders and potentially reaching you whether, once you return to the country of origin or to the country that's funding you.
Thank you so much, Nasrin and Naz. I'll go to the questions that the country director, is supposed to answer, posed by the executive director. I'll ask them together in the interest of time, because I also want to give the floor to Tom and Abdurrahman. So the executive director asks the country director, are you complying with all relevant laws and policies? And should we continue to operate in Landistan? And what do you answer? Wendy.
Thanks. Well, I guess my first question would be, whose laws and policies? Is it your country where you're headquartered? Is it your donor country laws and policies? Is it the country in which you're working? And so it's about, I think, really reconciling all of those, being very well aware of what those different laws and policies are, and having negotiated as much as you can where you feel that those laws and policies are untenable or are obstructing your operations or put you at risk of being in violation of laws. So I would respond to the director by looking at those different streams.
Great. Any other views on that? No, I'm just looking at, there's a lot of comments online, but I think they were referred to the previous questions. Yes, I think they're all referred to the previous questions. Maybe this question has not been filtered through. Jean-Michel.
Yes. Hi. I will continue on the point. I think that the element of here is also to say, okay, what are the laws? What are the risks of not complying? That's one of the key questions. And there's what are the alternatives? Because I think that, especially now with headquarters, organization having several headquarters, you have to have the possibility of changing headquarters. If it's about domestic rules, you change headquarters. If it's a donor, you change donor. So I think it's also to look at what are the alternatives to be compliant, and then on non-complying, I think that there is several times where organizations are not complying with the laws, but it's after a due diligence on the risk that we are taking, and so we are in a sector, we are always taking risks. In this question, all this question is case that exists, and every time we are taking a measure risk.
Thank you so much. That's definitely to the core of the discussion. Nazan Dasin, do you want to comment on this latest round of answers?
Yeah, I'll be very brief, and I would note that the online discussion is really interesting, because we have online someone who's also saying you should just pull out. You are clearly in violation of multiple domestic criminal laws, Security Council resolutions, and that's it. You shouldn't be operating in the country anymore, which, in humanitarian discussions internally, we tend to rarely put that option on the table. But of course, that is one that, if not your executive director, your board is very likely to ask if that is the answer to this question. Two quick things here. One is, I think Wendy's point about whose law is not just a crucial question, but it's one that we really encourage organizations to think about. There's a tendency to see this issue as so confusing that we kind of throw our hands up and say, how can you ever know? Well, you can know, right? So whose funding are you accepting? Does their law apply to you in Landistan? Does Landistani law apply to you in this context? And are you in a relationship with the United Nations, which would then bring Security Council resolutions down to you through their partner agreements? So what are the regulations that apply to you? I think it's a crucial question to ask. Secondly, I think there is I think HPG research, perhaps more than any other research of late, demonstrates that even in situations where we tend to say, if you don't pay, you will not have access, there are groups that stand strong and don't pay and continue to be principled and benefit from that. So I think there's an opportunity here to really be self-critical and question our own assumptions, that when we hear the rumor mill that you just can't get through unless you pay, is that the case? Can you get information that indicates whether or not that's accurate? And then finally, the gentleman who spoke last, I think one of the most promising areas that I've seen on this issue is more sophisticated approaches to understanding risk. So if you are able to say, we have analyzed the risk and we have understood not only the risk of diversion or some resources going to the AOA, but also the risk that people are going to die, people are going to starve, people will not have medical care. Does your organization have a way of thinking about risk in a way that makes it clear to the donors that they are a partner in risk? They share your risk. They cannot simply push it down to you and then you push it down to the local organization. And that, I think, is one of the areas where there's a lot of room for work and additional dialogue on this issue, is to say, is the humanitarian system, if you will, understanding that that's a problematic term, in a position to start thinking about risk in a way that allows for a conversation with donors that doesn't simply say, we accept whatever framing you place upon us on these kinds of issues. Back over to you, Sarah.